It was 2:47 a.m. when the alarms began to scream. The ICU is never silent, but that night the sound was different, urgent, chaotic, alive. I remember the sterile scent of antiseptic, the cold blue light from the monitors painting ghostly shadows on the walls. Nurses moved fast, their shoes squeaking across the tile floor, voices clipped and tense. I was one of them, a neurology nurse for over a decade, trained to stay calm when everything else fell apart. But that night, something inside me shifted. The patient's name was Michael Lawson, 42 years old. Collapsed at home after what appeared to be a seizure. Paramedics said he stopped breathing for a short time before they brought him back. When I first saw him, he was already on a ventilator, pupils unresponsive, the rhythmic hiss of the machine filling the silence between alarms. The attending neurologist suspected massive brain injury, likely irreversible. On paper, he was another tragic case, another sudden life interrupted. But nothing about that night would follow the rules. I remember placing my hand gently on his wrist, feeling for the faint, mechanical pulse. The monitor's beeping echoed like a clock, counting down the last seconds of something sacred. Around us, the team prepared medications, adjusted tubes, noted readings. It was supposed to be routine stabilization, the kind of moment that blends into a nurse's long list of shifts. And then, everything changed. His vitals spiked without warning. The flat rhythm of his EEG trembled just for a second. His body jolted, a twitch, maybe a reflex. But then his hand moved again, purposeful this time. His fingers brushed the side rail as if he were reaching for something. I froze. Sarah, one of the residents said. He's posturing, brainstem reflexes. But I wasn't so sure, because when I looked closer, I saw his eyelids flutter. A heartbeat later, they opened. What I saw wasn't the blank, absent stare of a comatose patient. His gaze found mine, focused, present. His lips parted, the sound rasping through the ventilator's hiss. And then, with a weak, shaking breath, he whispered, "Don't let me die again." The room went still. The machines continued their steady song, but every person in that space froze. I remember glancing at the monitor. His brain activity was flat. No explanation, no logic, just that impossible voice. For a few seconds, I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe exhaustion, maybe suggestion. But then he did it again, just one word this time, barely audible. Again. His heart rate spiked, and then slowly began to settle. The doctor called for another scan, but the moment had already slipped away, vanishing into the hum of machines. No one said much afterward. We charted, we cleaned, we moved on. That's what hospitals do. But I couldn't shake the chill running down my spine. I'd seen countless comas. I'd been in rooms where people slipped away and others came back. But this wasn't in any textbook. Later, as the shift dragged toward dawn, I sat in the break room staring at the coffee machine's blinking light. Outside, the first traces of sunrise crept through the windows, pale and indifferent. I could still hear his voice, clear as if he'd whispered it into my ear. "Don't let me die again." I didn't understand it then. Maybe I still don't. But I knew one thing for certain as that night ended. This was not going to be just another case. This was the beginning of something that would follow me for years, a mystery that medicine couldn't explain and my heart couldn't forget. I've seen comas. I've seen brain death. But what happened that night didn't follow any rule I was ever taught. Before that night, Michael Lawson was just another name on a patient chart. But when I looked at the photo his wife brought in, a smiling man with bright eyes holding 2 little girls at a lakeside cabin, he became something else. A person, a life, someone whose story stretched far beyond the sterile walls of our ICU. Michael was 42, an engineer from Portland. He spent his weekends fixing things, broken fences, children's bikes, old radios. His wife Emily told me he was the kind of man who couldn't stand to see anything left undone. He always had to finish what he started, she said, her voice trembling as she stared through the glass at his still form. He wasn't supposed to just stop. In the hours after his collapse, the team worked to uncover why. The scans showed swelling in his brain, and the leading theory was an undiagnosed arteriovenous malformation, an AVM. It's a tangle of blood vessels that can rupture without warning, flooding the brain with blood and starving vital tissue of oxygen. I'd seen it before. It's fast, merciless, and often silent until it's too late. I explained it to Emily as gently as I could. "It's like a hidden fault line," I said. "You never know it's there until it breaks." She nodded, tears catching the light, but I could see the disbelief in her eyes. Michael had been healthy, active, no warning signs. "He ran 5 miles that morning," she whispered. He came home, played with the girls, and then just collapsed. The more I read his file, the less sense it made. The timeline was short, too short. Paramedics estimated only 3 minutes without oxygen before resuscitation. With that brief a gap, we should have seen minimal damage, but the scans told another story. Diffuse hypoxic injury across both hemispheres, almost as if his brain had been starved for much longer. When I brought it up to Dr. Heller, our attending neurologist, he frowned. "Sometimes scans exaggerate early," he said. "We'll monitor, but I wouldn't get your hopes up." His tone was firm, clinical, but I couldn't let it go. Something wasn't fitting. And then there was what he'd said, the whisper. I told no one about it except one of my colleagues, Jenna. She listened, eyebrows furrowed, and then said quietly, "Patients in comas can sometimes vocalize. It's just the brainstem firing." But when I asked how a brainstem could form words that made sense, she didn't answer. Over the next 2 days, I kept noticing small things. The way Michael's hand seemed to twitch when Emily spoke. The faint changes in his heart rate when she mentioned their daughters. Once, when she leaned close and said, "Please come back to me," I saw his eyelids tremble. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, sensory echoes, residual activity. But deep down, a part of me felt something I couldn't explain. It wasn't just electrical signals firing, it felt like recognition. In the medical world, we treat the body, we stabilize, we diagnose, we repair. But that week, standing by Michael's bed, I started to wonder if what we treat isn't the whole story. Because as much as his body was shutting down, something in him seemed to still be reaching out, like a voice trying to break through static. We were treating a man's body, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still fighting to be heard. The next 48 hours blurred together in a haze of fluorescent light and quiet unease. I'd worked in neurology long enough to know the rhythm of comas, the slow fade of vitals, the steady decline of brainwaves. But Michael Lawson didn't follow that rhythm. He hovered in a strange limbo as if caught between two realities. Not alive, not gone. Something in between. His EEG showed near flat lines, barely any measurable activity. But still, every time his wife spoke, something flickered. A tremor in his fingers, a shift in breathing. Subtle but real. "Reflexes," the doctor said. "Residual pathways." I nodded because that's what science told us to believe. Yet every time I passed his room, I felt the same electric tension in the air, the sense that someone was there, listening. On my third consecutive night shift, the ward was unusually still. The hum of ventilators filled the corridors like distant waves. I stopped outside Michael's room, drawn by something I couldn't quite name. The lights were dim. The monitors cast soft glows across his pale skin, and for a moment, the world felt suspended. I stepped closer, checking his vitals out of habit, but my eyes stayed fixed on his face. It wasn't fear I felt. It was awareness, like standing in a quiet forest and realizing something unseen is watching you back. I'd heard families talk about presence before, how they could feel their loved ones, even when machines said otherwise. I'd always listened politely, comforted them, but never believed it. That night, though, belief didn't matter. It was undeniable. At around 2:50 a.m., Emily arrived. She couldn't sleep, she said. I let her sit beside him while I made my rounds. A few minutes later, I heard her voice, soft, trembling. "Michael, if you can, hear me. It's okay. You can rest." When I glanced back through the glass, I froze. His eyelids fluttered. I entered quietly, my heart pounding. Emily hadn't noticed. She kept speaking, tears streaking her cheeks. "The girls love you. We love you. You don't have to fight anymore." Then, just as she leaned closer, his lips moved. I didn't hear words, just a faint exhale. But it was there. Real. Intentional. Emily gasped. "Did you see that?" she whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. The monitor still showed near flat lines. No surge, no sign of cortical activity. Yet he had moved. I called Dr. Heller. He examined Michael, expression tight. "Brainstem response," he muttered. "Nothing more." But I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes before he turned away. That night, I couldn't leave his side. I sat in the corner of his room, the rhythmic beeps counting the seconds. Machines hissed and clicked, but beneath that mechanical noise, I swore I could hear something softer, the faint rhythm of a breath that didn't belong to the ventilator. 12 a.m. The monitor alarm pierced the silence. His heart rate plummeted. The screen flatlined. I jumped to my feet as the code blue echoed down the hall. The team rushed in, moving on instinct. Compressions, adrenaline, oxygen. The room became a flurry of motion, voices colliding, machines screaming. And then, in the chaos, he took one final shuddering breath. His chest rose once, and a voice, weak and broken, slipped through the noise. "Tell Emily." The red door. Every hand froze midair. The defibrillator stood ready, unused. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Emily's eyes widened, tears spilling over as if she'd heard her name through the veil. Then silence. No pulse, no breath. Just the soft, endless tone of the flatline filling the air. We stood there for what felt like forever. The doctor finally said the time of death. But I couldn't move. I just kept staring at him, my gloved hands trembling. Those were the last words Michael Lawson ever spoke, and they would haunt every one of us who heard them. In the hours after Michael's passing, the ICU felt unnaturally quiet. The alarms had stopped, the machines were unplugged, and yet the silence seemed heavier than any sound. I stood outside his room long after the team had left, staring at the stillness that had replaced all that urgency. "Tell Emily the red door." Those words played over and over in my mind, looping endlessly, refusing to let go. When Emily returned later that morning to collect his belongings, I hesitated to tell her. How could I? Families cling to every final word, and sometimes those words are nothing more than electrical noise. Still, when I saw her holding his wedding ring and shaking hands, I couldn't stay silent. "Emily," I began softly. Before he passed, he said something. She looked up at me, eyes rimmed red. "He spoke?" she whispered. I nodded. He said, "Tell Emily the red door." For a moment, she just stared, unblinking. Then her lips parted. "The red door?" she repeated, her voice breaking. I asked if it meant anything to her, and that's when she started to cry. Deep, quiet sobs that came from somewhere buried. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "It's the cabin," she said. "His father built it before he died." The door was painted red. Michael always said that place felt like home, like peace. Her reaction sent chills down my spine. I wanted to tell her there must be a rational explanation, that maybe he'd once mentioned it in passing and my mind had filled in the rest. But deep down I knew I'd heard him clearly. The timing, the clarity, the way he said her name, it wasn't random. It wasn't reflex. Later that day I reviewed the monitor data. I checked every log, every second of his vitals around the time he spoke. Nothing. No surge of brain activity, no anomaly in the EEG. The equipment recorded a man already gone, a body without consciousness. And yet, he had spoken. When I brought it up to Dr. Heller, he was polite but dismissive. "Neural discharges," he said. "Muscle memory. The dying brain fires off fragments of sound all the time. But fragments don't form full sentences. Fragments don't know your wife's name. And they certainly don't reference private memories no one in the room could have known." That evening, as I walked to my car, the hospital lights behind me flickered through the glass doors, white, sterile, unfeeling. I thought of that red door Emily had described, of the warmth and the peace it represented to him. And for the first time in my career, I felt the ground shift beneath what I thought I knew about death. Science can measure brainwaves, oxygen, and heartbeats, but it can't measure presence. And that's what I felt that night. Not the end of something, but the faint trace of someone stepping just beyond our reach. After Michael's death, the ward moved on as it always does. New patients came in, new emergencies filled the night, and life continued its steady rhythm. But for me, something had changed. The shift ended, the chart was closed, and yet his voice stayed, soft, distant, echoing in the back of my mind. "Tell Emily the red door." It followed me into every quiet corner, every break room silence, every sleepless night. I told myself it was just grief. Nurses don't like to admit how deeply cases affect us. We compartmentalize, because if we don't, we break. But the truth is, there are cases that crawl under your skin and never leave. Michael's was one of them. The day after his passing, I saw Emily again. She brought flowers for the nurse's station, a small gesture of gratitude in the face of unimaginable loss. She hugged me before she left. "Thank you," she whispered. "I think he found peace." Her words were kind, but her eyes carried that same quiet confusion, the need for meaning that medicine couldn't offer. That night, I dreamed for the first time. I was standing in a forest, mist curling around tall pines. The air was cold, but strangely comforting. Ahead of me stood a cabin, weathered and still. Its door, painted deep red, gleamed faintly beneath the light filtering through the trees. I could hear someone breathing on the other side. I reached for the handle, heart racing, and then I woke up. I told myself it was coincidence, that my mind was replaying Emily's story, filling in the blanks. But the dreams kept coming, night after night. The same scene, the forest, the door, the silence that hummed with something just out of reach. Sometimes I heard his voice again. Not words, just the cadence of breathing, the whisper of presence. During the day, I functioned as usual. I changed dressings, adjusted drips, documented vitals, but I started noticing small details in other patients. The subtle movement of fingers, the faint flutters behind closed eyelids. Things I'd seen for years, but never truly looked at. And I began to wonder, how many times had we mistaken awareness for reflex? A few weeks later, I stood in the ICU at dawn, sunlight spilling across the empty bed where Michael had lain. The machines were gone. Only faint outlines on the floor remained, where wheels had pressed against linoleum. I closed my eyes and listened. The hospital hummed around me, but beneath it all, there was something quieter, something steady. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was him. I'd spent years telling families their loved ones couldn't hear them, that consciousness fades when the brain shuts down. It was science. It was truth. But after Michael Lawson, I wasn't so sure anymore. Because sometimes, even after the machines stop, something lingers. Something that refuses to be measured. And sometimes, if you stand still enough, you can almost hear it breathe. Years passed before I could talk about Michael's case without my throat tightening. Even then, I could never bring myself to call it an incident, It wasn't an incident, it was an encounter. Something that brushed against the edges of what we understand about life and refused to let go. I began to dig, quietly at first. Late nights after shifts, reading case studies, old medical journals, and patient accounts buried in research archives. I wasn't searching for proof of anything supernatural, just an explanation that made sense. But the deeper I went, the more I found that even science had its gray zones. One neurologist I spoke to, Dr. Avery Lynn, specialized in disorders of consciousness. When I told her about Michael, she listened without interruption, eyes narrowed in thought. "There's a term for what you're describing," she said. "Terminal lucidity. Sometimes, right before death, patients show a sudden return of awareness, speaking, recognizing loved ones, even moving with intention. I'd read about it. Brief awakenings in people whose brains were considered beyond recovery. But the mechanism? No one knew. It's not uncommon," she continued, "but it defies our current models. The dying brain shouldn't have the coordination for speech or coherent thought." Another theory pointed to residual neural activity, tiny sparks in the brainstem firing in random patterns. Maybe, I thought, one of those sparks happened to form words. But that explanation didn't settle me, because randomness doesn't remember a red door. I spoke to a neuroscientist at a university lab who studied near-death experiences. He explained that the brain under extreme stress can produce vivid, hyperreal sensations, a flood of electrical activity as consciousness shuts down. "It can feel more real than reality itself," he said. "That's why people report tunnels, lights, voices." Maybe Michael had been caught in that storm, a fragment of awareness, firing one last message into the world before the lights went out. Maybe his words were the echo of a dream only he could see. But then I'd remember Emily's face when I told her about the red door, the recognition, the way it hit something private and sacred. And no theory seemed big enough to hold that. In the years since, I've learned to hold both truths in the same hand, the logic of medicine and the mystery of what lies beyond it. We know how neurons fire, how oxygen fuels thought, how quickly the brain begins to fade once the heart stops. But what we don't know is where awareness goes in those last seconds, or if it goes anywhere at all. I started keeping a journal of the cases that didn't fit the rules, the moments that made even the most seasoned doctors fall silent. I wrote about Michael and others like him, not to prove anything, but to remember, to honor the space between science and spirit, where the impossible sometimes lives. Maybe the red door wasn't a place. Maybe it was a threshold, a crossing point between what we can measure and what we can only feel. And maybe, on the other side, someone was waiting for him to finally come home. It's been nearly 8 years since Michael Lawson's case, and still, I find myself thinking about him, about that night, those words, and the weight of silence that followed. You'd think time dulls memories like that, but some moments don't fade. They linger in the mind like an afterimage, faint but unyielding. Last autumn, I received a letter from Emily Lawson. It was brief, handwritten, with edges soft from being handled too often. Inside was a short note and a photo. The note read, "I thought you should see this. I finally went back." The photo showed a small cabin nestled in the trees, weathered, humble, its red door still bright against the gray of the wood. Beneath it, Emily had written, "The door he told you about." A few weeks later, I drove out there myself. It was a long, winding road through pine forests and open sky, the kind of landscape that makes you quiet inside. When I pulled up, the world around me seemed to hold its breath. The air was cold, crisp, scented faintly of rain and pine needles. The red door stood out, vivid and calm, like it had been waiting all along. Emily met me outside. She looked older, of course, but her eyes still had that same gentleness I remembered from the hospital. We didn't talk about medicine or miracles. We just stood there for a while, listening to the wind move through the trees. Finally, she said softly, "When he died, I couldn't stop wondering if there was something I missed, something he was trying to tell me. Coming here again, it feels like he found a way to say goodbye." I wanted to believe her. And maybe, in that moment, I did. Standing before that red door, I thought about all the patients I've cared for, all the lives that began and ended in rooms filled with machines and human hands doing their best to hold the line between life and death. You tell yourself it's just biology, just chemistry and time. But sometimes something slips through the cracks of what we can explain. That's what haunts me. Not fear, but wonder. The possibility that consciousness isn't a light that simply goes out, but a flame that flickers somewhere beyond the dark, unseen but still burning. I can't prove it, and maybe I never will. But I've learned that not everything true can be measured. I still hear his voice sometimes, usually when the ward is quietest. "Don't let me die again." I don't know what he meant. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was something deeper, some echo from a place we haven't named yet. But I've come to think those words weren't about death at all. Maybe they were a plea to remember, to keep him alive in the only way we can, through story, through meaning, through wondering. Every nurse carries ghosts. Some are regrets. Some are mysteries. And some remind us that even in the silence after the last heartbeat, the human spirit might still be awake. whispering softly from beyond the threshold. I don't know what waits on the other side of the red door. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But I do know this. Every so often when I close my eyes, I still see it there, waiting quietly in the trees. And somewhere in that quiet, I think Michael Lawson finally found his way home.